Mecca, Islam's holiest city. It was here on August 7, 2026, that Saudi Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman, Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdogan, and Pakistani Prime Minister Shehbaz Sharif signed a mutual defense pact. Each signatory brings a different strategic asset to the table. Saudi Arabia has enormous financial resources generated by oil exports, as well as crucial geographic position between the Persian Gulf and the Red Sea. Its standing is reinforced by the Saudi monarch's role as custodian of Islam's two holy mosques, giving the kingdom unique prestige across the Muslim world. Pakistan, meanwhile, fields an army of more than 500,000 personnel and is the only Muslim-majority country with nuclear weapons. Turkey also commands a large military, the second largest in NATO by personnel, and has built a powerful, increasingly innovative defense industry best known for its drones. Geographically, it also straddles two continents, Europe and Asia. The Mecca Pact comes at a critical moment not only for Saudi Arabia, but for the entire Middle East. For nearly 6 months, the United States has been at war with Iran. Donald Trump has declared victory several times, yet the conflict continues, and Washington has failed to bring it to a decisive conclusion. The war has led to an effective Iranian blockade of the Strait of Hormuz, and has also cast a shadow over the Red Sea, where Yemen's Houthis have announced a blockade of Saudi shipping and threatened to close the Bab al-Mandab Strait. The security of two of the world's most important energy choke points is now in doubt. So increasingly is the credibility of American security guarantees in the Middle East. It is against this backdrop that Saudi Arabia, Turkey and Pakistan have signed a mutual defense agreement. Unsurprisingly, the media quickly found a catchy name for it: the Islamic NATO. Some commentators see the pact as the embryo of a Muslim collective defense system, and as a mechanism that could allow regional states to reduce their dependence on the American security umbrella. There is even speculation that Saudi Arabia and Turkey may now be indirectly covered by Pakistan's nuclear deterrent. But while the label Islamic NATO makes for a compelling headline, reality, as so often happens, is far more complicated, and therefore far more interesting. Let's see why. The Mecca Pact cannot be understood in isolation from the war with Iran, and above all from the broader regional context. Although the fighting is still underway, it has been clear since April, when the first ceasefire took effect, that America has suffered a strategic defeat. The American-Israeli assault not only failed to bring down the Islamic Republic, it also pushed Iran to carry out a threat it had made for years, blocking the Strait of Hormuz. Despite Donald Trump repeatedly declaring the war won, the United States has proved unable to break the Iranian blockade and restore normal shipping through Hormuz. Worse still, the White House refuses to acknowledge that it has suffered a spectacular setback in a war it chose to start. The Gulf crisis therefore drags on, while President Trump floats increasingly detached ideas, including the suggestion that he may soon declare Hormuz, quote, United States territory. The war with Iran has also left a deep mark on America's relations with its Arab partners in the Persian Gulf. The conflict initiated by Trump, followed by Iran's blockade of Hormuz, has crippled a large share of the region's oil and gas exports, generating losses running into billions of dollars. As if that were not enough, Washington's Arab partners were pulled directly into the conflict once Iran began striking American bases on their territory, as well as local critical infrastructure. The result was deeply paradoxical. The US bases meant to guarantee the Gulf states' security proved vulnerable to Iranian attacks themselves. At the same time, their presence gave Tehran a pretext to broaden its retaliation against the countries hosting them, especially their oil and gas infrastructure. It is hardly surprising then that Riyadh has begun questioning the value of American security guarantees. For Saudi Arabia, the situation is particularly frustrating because this is hardly the first time those guarantees have failed to deliver. The Saudis remember 2019 when attacks on Abqaiq and Hurai's facilities temporarily knocked out more than half of the kingdom's oil production. Donald Trump said at the time that America was, quote, locked and loaded, but ultimately chose not to retaliate militarily against Iran. Yet inaction is only part of the problem. Even when the United States does use force, it has increasingly struggled to achieve a decisive result. Leaving aside the current war with Iran, a good example is the American air campaign against Yemen's Houthis in 2024 and 2025. It was meant to end the blockade around the Bab al-Mandab Strait and halt Houthi attacks on Israel. Instead, it ended in strategic stalemate. Saudi doubts concern not only American passivity or the declining effectiveness of US military power, but also Washington's limited ability to restrain its Israeli ally. For Riyadh, the real shock came in September 2025, when Israel struck Hamas leaders in Qatar. The episode demonstrated that neither hosting CENTCOM's forward headquarters nor holding major non-NATO ally status was enough to shield Qatar from an Israeli airstrike. The erosion of American credibility and the broader deterioration of the Gulf security environment are therefore not new developments. Riyadh has spent several years looking for additional partners and ways to reduce its dependence on Washington. That is why in 2023, Saudi Arabia bypassed the United States, accepted Chinese mediation, and normalized relations with Iran. And in 2025, it signed a mutual defense agreement with Pakistan. The current war with Iran has therefore done less to create a new problem than to bring years of accumulated tensions to a head and accelerate an already ongoing diversification of Saudi security policy. The Mecca Pact is the next step in the same strategy. What makes this alliance particularly interesting is that its members bring very different strengths to the table, and in many respects, those strengths complement one another. Saudi Arabia has enormous financial resources and a strategic position between the Persian Gulf and the Red Sea. At the same time, it remains highly exposed to attacks from Iran, Yemen's Houthis, and Iraqi militias aligned with Tehran. The kingdom needs more effective air and missile defenses, as well as partners willing to share technology. That matters all the more because under Saudi Vision 2030, Riyadh wants to build up its own defense industry. Turkey brings NATO's second largest military by personnel, extensive combat experience, and the most advanced and diversified defense industry of the three. It produces drones, missiles, warships, radars, and electronic warfare systems. Ankara, in turn, gains access to Saudi capital, new contracts, and greater influence in the Gulf. At the same time, it can help Riyadh develop its domestic arms industry. That cooperation is already taking concrete form. In 2023, Saudi Arabia's purchase of Turkish Ankici drones was accompanied by an agreement between Baykar and Saudi Arabian military industries. It covered technology transfer, local production, final testing, training, and technical support. All of this fits Riyadh's goal of localizing more than 50% of military spending by 2030. Pakistan contributes the largest army of the three, substantial operational experience, and deep military ties with both partners. Pakistani troops have trained Saudi forces for decades, and the number deployed in the kingdom has at times exceeded 10,000. With Turkey, Islamabad cooperates on shipbuilding, aviation, drones, and joint exercises. Then there is Pakistan's nuclear arsenal. In return, Islamabad is looking above all for Saudi investment, energy supplies, and financial support, as well as contracts for its own defense industry and a larger role in the Middle East. On paper, then, the Mecca Pact looks formidable. Saudi Arabia, Pakistan, and Turkey together field nearly 1.4 million active duty personnel, more than 3,000 military aircraft, 6,000 tanks, and 344 naval vessels. Add Turkey's defense industry, Pakistan's nuclear weapons, and Saudi Arabia's financial firepower, and the combined potential is substantial. But simply adding up national arsenals does not create a unified military force. These are three countries with very different security priorities. Riyadh is focused primarily on Iran and its regional allies. Islamabad is preoccupied with its rivalry with India. Ankara is concerned with Syria, the Kurdish issue, and its competition with Israel. The key question, therefore, is not how many soldiers or tanks they possess, but how much of that power each signatory would actually be willing to use in defense of the others. According to the joint statement issued by the members of the Mecca Pact, an armed attack on one signatory will be treated as an attack on all. That single sentence is what triggered the entire narrative about, quote, an Islamic NATO. But the full text of the agreement has not been published, and official statements do not spell out the actual defense obligations. We do not know who would determine that an attack sufficient to trigger the pact had occurred, what the geographical scope of the guarantees would be, what kind of assistance each signatory would be required to provide, or whether any joint operational plans have been prepared. The first clues as to what this kind of mutual defense might look like in practice come from the Saudi-Pakistani defense agreement signed last year. It contained a similar clause stating that an attack on one signatory would be treated as an attack on both. Yet, when the war with Iran began and Iranian missiles and drones started hitting Saudi Arabia, Pakistan did not enter the conflict on the kingdom's side. But that does not mean Islamabad remained passive. It deployed around 8,000 troops to Saudi Arabia, along with a squadron of JF-17 fighters, drones, and a Chinese-made HQ-9 air defense system. The Pakistani fighters, however, arrived only after the first ceasefire between the United States and Iran had already been agreed. Pakistan's response, therefore, looked less like joint participation in the war and more like limited defensive assistance. It reduced the burden on Saudi forces and strengthened the kingdom's ability to withstand further Iranian attacks. The Mecca Pact could work in much the same way. Pakistan and Turkey may train Saudi personnel, supply weapons, share intelligence, and reinforce the kingdom's air defenses, without automatically entering a war on Riyadh's behalf. Nuclear weapons are a separate question. There is no public evidence that Islamabad has formally extended its nuclear umbrella to either Saudi Arabia or Turkey. After Riyadh and Islamabad signed a similar agreement in 2025, Pakistan's defense minister and other officials suggested that the commitment might also cover Pakistan's, quote, strategic assets, in other words, its nuclear arsenal. That interpretation was quickly played down, however, and Pakistani officials later maintained that the agreement had not created a formal nuclear umbrella over Saudi Arabia. The ambiguity itself may have some deterrent value, but the fact that one member of an alliance possesses nuclear weapons should not be confused with extended nuclear deterrence covering others. And even a formal nuclear umbrella would do little to solve most of Riyadh's immediate security problems. Nuclear weapons may deter an existential attack by another state, but they are far less useful against Yemen's Houthis or Iraqi militias. The absence of an automatic obligation to go to war does not make the pact irrelevant. It simply means it should be judged by a different standard than NATO. The Mecca Pact should be understood against three broader trends: the deterioration of security across the Middle East, the declining credibility of the United States, and the growing importance of middle powers. Developments we have been discussing on this channel for several years. Middle powers are states that are not superpowers but possess enough economic, military, and political weight and enough ambition to actively shape their surroundings. Today's middle powers increasingly act on their own terms. They build their own networks of cooperation and try to avoid excessive dependence on any single great power. That does not mean abandoning existing alliances or choosing one side in the global rivalry. It means preserving room to maneuver. This is particularly clear in the case of the Pact's three signatories. Turkey remains a member of NATO, but increasingly uses that membership to pursue its own interests. Saudi Arabia still sees the United States as its most important military partner, while simultaneously expanding ties with China, Turkey and Pakistan. Islamabad maintains a strategic partnership with Beijing, yet is also trying to rebuild cooperation with Washington and expand its military role beyond South Asia. None of these countries wants to close off its options. The Mecca Pact is therefore meant to complement existing alliances and partnerships, not replace them. Despite a series of mistakes in the Middle East, Washington remains an attractive partner because it offers access to advanced weapons, cutting-edge technology, intelligence, and Western financial markets. What is changing is the way regional states manage their relationship with America. Cooperation with the USA is becoming less exclusive, while its partners seek to reduce their dependence on decisions made in Washington. They do not want to base their entire security on a single country that may act selectively, condition assistance on concessions, or draw allies into a conflict and then fail to shield them from its consequences. The war with Iran has shown that this risk is no longer merely theoretical. Instead, middle powers such as Saudi Arabia, Turkey and Pakistan want greater strategic autonomy. That does not require self-sufficiency or a break with the great powers. The goal is simply to expand the number of available partners and policy options. The more alternatives Riyadh, Ankara and Islamabad have, the lower the price they pay for refusing to meet Washington's expectations. It is also worth looking at how the White House has responded to the Mecca Pact. President Trump not only refrained from criticizing it, he praised it. In Trump's worldview, the pact fits neatly into his long-standing emphasis on burden sharing, US allies taking greater responsibility for their own defense and for regional security. But there is a fundamental problem with that interpretation. Saudi Arabia, Turkey and Pakistan are assuming greater responsibility largely because they have lost confidence in the effectiveness of the American security umbrella. For the signatories, the pact is an additional insurance policy against further US failures. Had American guarantees worked as expected during the war with Iran, the need for such a regional mechanism would have been far weaker. Still, the United States is not about to lose its position as the most powerful military actor in the Middle East. What it is gradually losing is its near monopoly over the security architecture of its regional partners. As alternative arrangements develop, Washington will find it harder to use American protection as a source of political leverage. Over time, that will also reduce its influence over decisions made across the region. America will retain the greatest military capabilities, but translating that superiority into political obedience from its partners will become increasingly difficult. The Mecca Pact is therefore one expression of the emerging age of middle powers. Regional states will continue to cooperate with great powers, but they are increasingly determined to shape the terms of that cooperation themselves. After considering the nature of this so-called Islamic NATO, it is worth turning to its concrete regional consequences. The agreement affects not only the position of its signatories, but also the calculations of Israel, the United Arab Emirates, India, Egypt, and Iran. The first implication concerns Saudi-Israeli normalization. Under current conditions, it is clear that Riyadh has no intention of pursuing Donald Trump's grand plan of joining the Abraham Accords. Only a few hours ago, Israel could still be seen as a potential partner in balancing Iran. But after the war in Gaza, the strike on Doha, the invasions of Lebanon and Syria, and the war with Iran, the Saudis increasingly see Israel as one of the main sources of instability in the region, especially because the United States is not always able or willing to restrain its Israeli ally. The Mecca Pact could also deepen the rivalry between Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates. The Saudi-Emirati partnership had already begun to fray amid competition over which country would become the region's leading economic hub, as well as diverging interests in Yemen, Sudan, Somalia, and the wider Horn of Africa. For Abu Dhabi, closer cooperation between Riyadh and Ankara is particularly problematic. Saudi Arabia and Turkey back many of the same factions in Sudan and the Horn of Africa, factions that compete with those supported by the UAE. From the Emirati perspective, the Mecca Pact is therefore clearly a challenge. What is less clear is how Abu Dhabi will try to counter it, by repairing ties with Riyadh or by moving even closer to Israel. At this stage, the second option appears more likely. The agreement also complicates Saudi Arabia's relationship with India. Riyadh certainly has no intention of abandoning its close economic and energy ties with New Delhi, but formal commitments to Pakistan will make it harder for the kingdom to remain neutral during the next India-Pakistan crisis. At the same time, India has developed close partnerships with Israel and the UAE and is part of the Kojder project, which is intended to connect India with Europe through the Persian Gulf and Israel. The Mecca Pact therefore sharpens an existing contradiction in Indian strategy between its growing relationship with Gulf states on the one hand and its strategic partnership with Israel and rivalry with Pakistan on the other. Egypt's position perhaps best illustrates the potential costs of joining the Mecca Pact. Cairo took part in a series of consultations preceding the agreement and was widely presented as a likely member. In the end, however, it was not among the initial signatories. That does not necessarily mean Egypt has ruled out joining altogether. Ankara continues to describe Egypt as a natural partner and argues that its accession depends only on resolving a number of, quote, technical issues. In reality, the problem is much broader. Egypt is wary of commitments that could draw it into other countries' conflicts. Turkey is competing with Israel and remains at odds with Greece and Cyprus in the eastern Mediterranean. Cairo maintains important relations with all of them, while also needing to preserve its peace treaty with Israel and continued access to American assistance. The most complicated implications, however, concern Iran. For years, Tehran has argued that Middle Eastern security should be organized by the countries of the region themselves, without the United States. At the level of rhetoric, the Mecca Pact therefore appears to validate part of Iran's long-standing argument. The problem is that Tehran envisioned a regional security system that would include Iran itself. The Mecca Pact, by contrast, was created partly in response to Iranian attacks and the actions of Iran-backed groups. Tehran's official reaction was cautious. Iranian Foreign Ministry spokesman Esmail Baghaei said Iran had no reason to fear the pact and argued that the agreement reflected a broader shift in regional thinking, a growing willingness among Middle Eastern states to rely on their own capabilities. At the same time, he stressed that regional security agreements should be inclusive and should correctly identify the source of the threat, which Iran sees as Israel. Other figures within the Iranian system were less conciliatory. Ebrahim Rezai, a member of Parliament's National Security and Foreign Policy Committee, dismissed the agreement as a, quote, paper pact that would not provide Saudi Arabia with real security. The two reactions capture Tehran's dilemma. The pact reinforces Iran's long-standing diagnosis that American security guarantees are weakening, but at the same time, it may create a new security challenge for Iran itself. And so the Mecca Pact does not mean that the United States is disappearing from the Middle East, nor it should be understood as an Islamic NATO. Its real significance is that it shows Washington gradually losing its near-exclusive role in organizing regional security. What is emerging instead looks more like a network of overlapping arrangements, each with different members and different levels of commitment. Bilateral ties with the United States will coexist with the pact between Turkey, Saudi Arabia, and Pakistan. Alongside them, smaller, mission-specific coalitions will emerge to deal with maritime security, air and missile defense, critical infrastructure, joint exercises, and arms production. That model is already beginning to take shape. On July 30th this year, Riyadh proposed creating a multinational maritime coalition to protect shipping in the Red Sea, the Bab al-Mandab Strait, and the Gulf of Aden. The initiative was backed by 14 governments, including Turkey, Pakistan, and Egypt. Regional states therefore do not need to accept full mutual defense commitments in order to participate in specific missions that serve their interests. That is the logic of the age of middle powers. Saudi Arabia, Turkey, and Pakistan are not global powers, but they have enough resources and ambition to build their own partnerships and shape their international environment. They cooperate with the United States, where doing so gives them access to technology, weapons, and Western markets, while simultaneously developing alternative channels of cooperation. Their goal is greater strategic autonomy, the ability to choose their own partners, instruments, and level of involvement. Yet that flexibility is also the model's greatest weakness. Only a few years ago, Turkey and Saudi Arabia stood on opposite sides of the conflicts unleashed by the Arab Spring. Riyadh took part in the blockade of Qatar, while Ankara sent additional troops to Doha. Saudi Arabia and the UAE once fought together in Yemen. Today they back competing forces there. The Mecca Pact does not eliminate such contradictions, and there is no guarantee that today's partners will not become tomorrow's rivals. So while this particular alliance may prove fragile, the forces behind agreements like the Mecca Pact are likely to be far more durable and to grow stronger in the years ahead. Above all, they reflect the rising importance of middle powers, the pursuit of greater strategic autonomy, and declining confidence in the effectiveness of American security guarantees.